He never looked like tragedy. That's the first twist in Bon Scott's story. Before the tattoos, before the howl that could cut through any bar in Australia, he was just a skinny kid from Fremantle with a grin too wild for his own good. People said he had that spark, the kind that makes you unforgettable and sometimes the kind that burns too hot to last. Even early on, Bon carried this storm energy around him, the sense that he wasn't built for a quiet life. And the crazy part, everyone who met him felt it. The charm, the chaos, the danger. It was all there long before AC/DC, long before the world realized that this guy was about to change rock forever. But the way he actually got there, the dirt roads, the trouble, the bands that nearly broke him, that part is stranger, tougher, and way more revealing than most fans ever hear. Before the arenas, before the stadium chants and the wall of Marshall amps, Bon Scott was grinding it out in the kind of clubs where the air tasted like sweat and old beer. He bounced between bands, the Spectors, the Valentines.
Made me feel so good. I'd like to hold you. If I only could.
Each one shaping him a little more, sanding nothing down, only sharpening the edges. He wasn't polished, he wasn't trained, he was raw electricity in human form, and that terrified as many people as it thrilled. And then came the bruises, literal ones, bar fights, bike crashes, bad nights that left scars on his body and on his reputation. But here's the part that people miss. Every disaster pushed him 1 inch closer to the version of Bon that AC/DC needed. He learned how to command a room because he had no other choice. He learned how to take over a stage because offstage, the world kept trying to knock him down. By the time he crossed paths with the Young Brothers, he wasn't just a singer, he was a weapon. Loud, unpredictable, and unstoppable. But what happened when that weapon got plugged into AC/DC changed everything. When Bon Scott stepped into AC/DC, it didn't feel like a lineup change. It felt like destiny finally snapping into place. The Young Brothers had the machine, but Bon had the fire. His voice didn't just ride the guitar riffs, it tore through them like a blade. He strutted, he laughed, he provoked the crowd, turning every show into something between a riot and a ritual. Even the band members later said it. Without Bon, AC/DC wouldn't just be different. They might not have survived at all, but here's the part that rarely gets talked about. As the crowds grew from noisy pub drunks to thousands of screaming fans, Bon found himself stuck between two versions of the world. On stage, he was untouchable, the pirate king of hard rock, a man who turned danger into charisma. Off stage, things were quieter and darker. The constant travel, the backstage chaos, the pressure to keep feeding the legend, it all sat heavy on him. The lifestyle didn't help. Bon lived fast because he didn't know another speed. He drank hard, partied harder, and had this reckless, almost poetic belief that life was supposed to burn, not fade. Friends said he would be the last one standing at the end of the night, half laughing, half daring the universe to try something. And the universe always did. There were nights he stumbled, nights he collapsed, nights when the road crew had to drag him back to the bus. But the next evening, he'd explode back onto the stage like nothing happened. When Highway to Hell hit, the band reached a level they had been chasing for years: sold-out shows, chart success, international recognition. Finally, AC/DC wasn't just a loud Australian curiosity, they were global. And yet the climb came with a price. The tours stretched longer, the expectations grew heavier, and Bon felt the squeeze in ways he didn't show publicly. He wrote about feeling worn out. He hinted to friends that the road was grinding him down. Still, he kept pushing, maybe too hard. And this is where the story takes its turn, because at the very moment AC/DC was standing on the edge of worldwide domination, when Bon Scott should have been celebrating the biggest triumph of his life. His lifestyle, his exhaustion, and the relentless pressure began steering him toward a single night in London that would change everything. And the events of that night are far stranger, more tragic, and more confusing than most fans ever realized. February 19th, 1980. London wasn't glamorous that night. It was cold, wet, the kind of winter evening where the city feels hungover. Bon Scott had spent the day drifting between friends, music discussions, and a small circle of people who knew his routine well enough not to ask too many questions. He wasn't on tour, he wasn't performing, he was just drifting. And that's what makes what happened next feel so eerie. There was no warning, no dramatic meltdown, nothing that screamed, "This is the night everything ends." Late that evening, Bon met up with a friend, Alistair Kinnear, for what was supposed to be a casual night out. They hit a few places, talked music, drank more than they should have. It wasn't unusual. Bon had done this 1,000 times. By most accounts, he wasn't angry, he wasn't depressed, he wasn't picking fights. If anything, he looked tired, bone tired, like the road was still in his veins even when he wasn't on it. Hours passed, drinks stacked, London blurred. Eventually, Kinnear drove Bon back to his place in a Renault 5, a small cramped car that would end up becoming one of the most infamous images in rock history. Bon was unconscious by the time they arrived, too heavy to move, too drunk to wake. So Kinnear did what a lot of people did back then. He left him in the car to sleep it off, a decision that still haunts the story. What happened between that moment and the morning is a void, a hard, cold silence that no investigation ever fully explained. But when Kinnear checked on him later, Bon wasn't snoring or mumbling or groaning awake. He wasn't breathing. Panic. Police. Ambulance. Too late. The official time of death was early morning. The cause? Death by misadventure. Acute alcohol poisoning. But here's where the story stops being clean, because when the details came out, the position of the body, the temperature that night, the inconsistencies in witness accounts, people started asking questions. Why was he left alone so long? Why didn't they take him inside? And why did the story change depending on who was telling it? For years, fans, journalists, and even medical professionals pointed out things that didn't quite add up. And those questions, they never went away, because the official report told one story, but the rumors that followed suggested something far darker and far more complicated. When the coroner's report came out, it was brutally simple. Acute alcohol poisoning, a cold clinical phrase that reduced one of rock's most explosive voices to a medical line on a form. The file described what they found: Bon lying on his back, lungs congested, body unresponsive, alcohol levels high enough to shut down his system. Death by misadventure. Case closed, at least on paper. But almost immediately, the story around that night started to warp. Friends who saw him days earlier said he wasn't in the kind of downward spiral that would make sense of a sudden collapse. Others pointed out that Bon had survived nights far worse, nights that would have leveled other rock singers. And then there was the weather. London hit freezing temperatures that night, a tiny Renault, a man unconscious, and a long stretch of hours in the cold. Hypothermia could have played a role, yet it wasn't mentioned in detail in the final conclusion, and the timeline raised even more eyebrows. Kinnear's account changed slightly over time, not dramatically, but just enough to create static in the story. Some versions say he checked on Bon once, others say twice. Some claim he tried to bring him inside but physically couldn't. Others insist he assumed Bon was safely passed out. Little inconsistencies, small fractures, but enough to make people wonder whether the truth was blurrier than the official record suggested. Then came the strangest part. Despite the worldwide shock, the investigation remained surprisingly brief. No major toxicology deep dive, no extended inquiry, no dramatic questioning of witnesses. The death of one of the world's most iconic frontmen was sorted with the efficiency of a routine accident. And for fans, for anyone who knew the chaotic brilliance of Bon Scott, that felt wrong, too quiet, too neat. It didn't take long for whispers to grow. Fans wanted answers, journalists dug around the edges, biographers started asking uncomfortable questions. And slowly, a second narrative emerged, one that suggested Bon's death might not have been as straightforward as the paperwork claimed, because in the shadows of that night was a rumor that refused to die, one involving something far more dangerous than alcohol. For years, the official story stood untouched. Alcohol, misadventure, tragic but simple. And then cracks. Tiny ones at first, then bigger. Biographers started interviewing people who weren't in the original reports. Former friends came forward with stories that didn't match the clean narrative. And slowly, one theory began circling louder than all the others. The idea that Bon Scott's death might have involved heroin. It wasn't a tabloid invention, it came from people who actually knew him in London's music scene. Musicians, roadies, insiders who said Bon occasionally dabbled in harder substances, especially when drinking. Not a full-time user, not addicted, but someone who might have mixed the wrong things on the wrong night. That's how the rumor started. Then came Jesse Fink's investigations, well known among AC/DC fans, which pointed out something unsettling. A few people in Bon's orbit that night were connected to heroin, and in the early 80s, mixing alcohol and heroin was a deadly cocktail that left victims looking, well, exactly like someone who passed out drunk. The symptoms could easily blur together, but here's where it gets even stranger. If heroin was involved, the signs might not have been obvious without a more detailed toxicology analysis. And remember, the original investigation was fast, minimal, almost hands-off. So people began asking a chilling question. Did the authorities simply assume alcohol because it was the easy answer? Still, there's the other side of the story. Bon had never been widely known as a heroin user. He wasn't part of the needle crowd. His close friends insisted it wasn't his style, and some of the claims surfaced decades later, long after memories had blurred and legends had hardened into myths. The heroin theory has enough gaps to remain unproven, and that's why this part of the story is so maddening. The evidence isn't solid enough to declare it truth, but it's compelling enough that nobody can fully erase it. It lives in this uncomfortable middle space. Not fact, not fiction, just a shadow stretching over the final hours of a man who already lived too close to the edge. But regardless of whether the rumors are true or not, one thing is certain: Bon Scott's death left a void so massive that AC/DC had a choice to make. A choice that would define rock history. And what the band did next didn't just change their future, it turned Bon into an immortal ghost hovering over every note they ever played again. When the news of Bon Scott's death hit AC/DC, the shock was volcanic. The band didn't just lose a singer, they lost the spark plug that turned their engine into a cannon. For a moment, everything froze. Malcolm and Angus went quiet. The label braced for the worst. Fans assumed the band was done, because how do you replace someone like Bon? You don't, not really. And that's exactly where the emotional weight of this story lives. Bon wasn't just a voice. He was the attitude, the danger, the swagger that made AC/DC feel alive. in a way no other band did. Without him, the group felt like a body missing a heartbeat, and yet something unbelievable happened. In the middle of grief, Malcolm and Angus made a decision that would change music forever. They chose to keep going, not in spite of Bon, but because of him. They believed he'd be the first to tell them to get off their asses and play. Enter Brian Johnson, a singer Bon himself admired, a guy whose vocal style wasn't identical but carried the same fire. Choosing him wasn't replacing Bon, it was following the path Bon had already opened. And what came next? It shouldn't have been possible. The band channeled their grief, their anger, their disbelief, and created one of the greatest rock albums of all time. Back in Black. 40 minutes of thunder, 40 minutes of mourning disguised as celebration. Every riff hit like a punch, every lyric felt like a farewell. Even the bells in the opening track were a funeral toll. But here's the part most fans feel deep down. No matter how huge AC/DC got, and they got massive, Bon never left. His ghost lingered in the music, in the stage energy, in the reckless spirit of every tour. Back in Black didn't bury him. It crowned him. It turned his life, his chaos, and his tragedy into something permanent. And that's the thing about Bon Scott. He didn't live long. He didn't live clean. He didn't live safe, but he lived big. So big that decades after that cold night in London, people still argue about what really happened, because losing a character like him feels like losing a piece of rock's soul. And maybe that's why the story never fades. Not because of the mystery, not because of the rumors, but because Bon Scott burned bright enough that people still can't believe the fire ever went out. In the end, Bon Scott's tragedy isn't just how he died, it's how close he was to everything he chased. After years of grinding through tiny bars and near disasters, he finally stood at the edge of global fame, and the world lost him before he could take the victory lap. But Bon didn't disappear with that night in London. He stayed in the music, in every scream of Back in Black, in every riff that shakes the floor, in every fan who feels that spark he carried like a second heartbeat. That's why the questions never fade. People aren't obsessed with his death, they're refusing to believe someone so alive could leave so suddenly. Bon Scott lived fast, burned bright, and left a mark too big for one lifetime. And maybe that's the truth behind the mystery. Some people don't vanish, they echo.